April 30th, 2020. It's a Thursday morning in Houston, Texas, the Lone Star State's largest city.
The metropolitan area is between 7 and 8 million people.
A lot of people are migrating here because of job opportunities.
We got all kind of commerce coming and going.
It's a great place to where even if you're not from here, you can find your place and feel at home.
But at the Houston home of Judy Rodriguez, she spent that Thursday morning becoming increasingly worried about her daughter, 33-year-old Darlene Solis.
Wednesday, I texted her, didn't hear anything back from her. Thursday, I messaged her and I said, "Are you okay?" When she didn't respond, that really worried me.
Darlene was very connected to friends and family, would text her mom multiple times a day.
So I started making phone calls to her friends and say, "Hey, have you all heard from Darlene?"
Hello? Hey, Diana, this is Darlene's mom. When's the last time you spoke with her?
Nobody had heard anything.
Really? No, this isn't like her.
Anxiety mounting, Judy calls her ex-husband, Darlene's stepfather, for help.
He's a sheriff's deputy, and I said, "Hey, I haven't heard from Darlene for 2 days, and none of her friends have heard from her."
Will you please go to her apartment and see if she's there? Thank you.
Darlene's stepfather agrees to head over, but asks his ex-wife to also contact the Houston police.
He told me to go ahead and call 911 because that was not his jurisdiction.
Houston Police, what are you reporting?
Yes, I was calling to see if you could do a welfare check on my daughter.
He needed, backup.
Do you know how long it'll be before your husband gets there?
He said he's 5 minutes out.
The Houston police are still en route. But Darlene's stepdad doesn't wait.
He turned on his body camera and had the apartment manager unlock Darlene's door.
With his training, his instinct, he knew that something was wrong.
"33-year-old Darlene Solis grew up in a tight-knit and loving family.
We had birthday parties at the house, Halloween parties, Christmas, we all got together.
She loved her family. She was the oldest of 5 siblings, and she was really close to them.
And her loyalty didn't stop there.
She has the biggest heart ever. She cares about people, and she's there for all of her friends.
They would go to Darlene if they needed someone to talk to, a shoulder to cry on.
She would always be the one to reach out to all of our friends and see how they're doing. She would make us dinner. She loved just catering to her friends.
In fact, Darlene spent her days and nights catering to almost everyone.
She started taking college courses for being a respiratory therapist and started working a side job as a bartender. And money was just coming in for her. So she stopped going to school.
She was there for years. So she built relationships with other people and her regulars and just the community.
When Darlene wasn't behind the bar, chances were she was off on an adventure.
Traveling brought joy to her. She traveled to Japan, she traveled to Vietnam. Even if it was a road trip, she would always make the time to go and travel.
And Darlene almost always had someone to share in her adventures.
Darlene was a very free-spirited person. She had a lot of male friends.
One was a construction worker named Corey Campbell.
It began through a mutual friend. They had met up at a bar for friends to get together, and then from there they started talking.
So you're a bartender?
Yeah.
Oh, look, I can see that. You're really good with people.
Thank you.
Yeah. They hit it off. They seem like a very good match.
They dated for the next 3 years.
She was happy they did have a good relationship.
He was a great guy, very respectful.
But in the end, it didn't last.
He was on the road all the time, and it seemed like that was hindering their relationship.
And when a new job took Corey to Salt Lake City, Darlene moved on to a man named Marcus Jennings.
Hey, babe.
She said that he was very nice. He treated her so well.
How was your day?
Better now.
And she ended up really enjoying his company. They spent a lot of time together.
I've never in my life seen her so happy.
But now, Darlene is missing. And her stepfather, a deputy sheriff, has gone to do a welfare check at her apartment.
Once he got in, it was not trashed. Didn't look like anything had been stolen.
However, Darlene's apartment is a crime scene.
Central, this is 42 David 24. I need HPD to be notified to meet me for a DOA. Apartment 110. It's my daughter.
He found Darlene dead of multiple gunshot wounds.
It's a homicide.
After her breakup from Corey Campbell, Darlene Solis bounced back with a new man named Marcus Jennings.
When Darlene started to date Marcus, you could tell she was happy. I've never in my life seen her so happy.
He was just always nice to her. I liked the way he treated her.
But their budding romance would be a short one. Darlene's stepfather, a Harris County Sheriff's deputy, has found his stepdaughter dead inside her apartment.
It's my daughter. Multiple gunshots. Multiple spent rounds.
He'd been in that situation thousands of times. He's responded to phone calls from everything from petty theft to, murders and aggravated assaults.
But this case is so different because this isn't some random patrol call for this deputy. This is his daughter.
When the Houston police arrive at the apartment, Darlene's stepfather turns the scene over to them.
This deputy was struggling with the scene of his daughter and all the emotions that takes place.
When police and EMTs enter the apartment, they confirm that Darlene is dead.
There are no vital signs.
The body was exhibiting clear signs of rigor mortis.
This had happened maybe 2 days prior.
And now it's up to the homicide detectives to piece together precisely what happened.
As you walk through the apartment, a typical homicide detective will allow the scene to talk to them. Are there items missing? Is there forced entry? Are there broken windows? Is this a disorganized scene? What's out of place? Was there an argument?
There doesn't appear to be any signs of a struggle or a robbery.
Things are not missing. Things are not forced into.
Whoever had killed her looked like they kind of caught her by surprise. She was just in the bathroom. Looked like she was making herself up to go somewhere.
Her body was positioned on her back, facing up, and in a position where it had seen that she had fallen and had remained in that fallen position since the time of her death.
She had been shot multiple times with a .40 caliber handgun.
There were 4 shell casings that were recovered from the crime scene.
They also find a .40 caliber handgun.
The gun was found under the bed, so whoever killed her leaves the murder weapon there on the scene.
All indications, standing out from the outside looking in, would indicate that this would be somebody that Darlene knew. That this was somebody who was in the apartment, did not have to force their way in.
But who? The crime scene provides a possible clue.
There was a blow-up mattress that was out in the living room.
There was luggage by the side of the bed.
But if someone had been staying with Darlene, where are they now? And did they have anything to do with her death?
Hoping for more information, the detectives turn to Darlene's stepfather, who has just gotten off the phone with her mother.
My ex-husband calls me back and says, we found her. She's here. And it was kind of like a relief, like, okay, good, she's there. And he tells me there's a deputy that's gonna go pick you up at the house and bring you over here. And it's like, oh, okay. And then after I hung up with him, I'm like, wait a minute. And I knew she was gone.
While Darlene's mother waits for a deputy to drive her to the crime scene, her ex-husband fills the detectives in on what he knows.
You just got to feel for somebody like this. Police officers are people too. And to come across that kind of scene, and this has to be so horrific, it's hard to put into words.
We're going to need to ask you a few questions.
I understand.
His mind pretty much shut off and turned into his professional role as officer investigator to figure out what he needed to do to make sure that the investigation and everything was done correctly from the start to make sure that whoever did it was held accountable.
Kudos to him, because it shows that the strength that some of these people have to draw upon in a situation like that.
Do you know of anyone who'd want to do this to Darlene?
No, she started dating this new guy named Marcus.
It's in that beginning stage where people are enthralled with each other.
How many cases have police covered where a boyfriend got jealous and killed their girlfriend?
And according to her stepfather, Marcus may have had reason to be jealous.
She also has an ex named Corey Campbell.
Do you think he had something to do with it?
I really don't know, but she did go to visit him last week.
Darlene had flown out to Utah to see Corey.
She took the opportunity to fly out there, and then they drove back to Houston together.
Detectives investigating the murder of Darlene Solis have learned that she had recently flown to Salt Lake City to visit her ex-boyfriend, Corey Campbell.
Corey was out of town working, and since she did love traveling, just going anywhere, she took the opportunity to fly out there.
She'd gone out and spent a few days in Salt Lake City with Corey.
And this new guy, Marcus, did he know she went to see him?
I really don't know.
Thank you for your time. Thanks, sir.
But there may be someone who can help. Darlene's friend, Melissa Hoffman, who arrived at the apartment shortly before Darlene's stepfather.
Our other friend, Diana, reached out to Darlene and didn't hear anything from her, which was weird. So she called me and asked me to go to Darlene's apartment because I was closer to see if she's home and if she's okay. And then her dad ended up showing up.
4023.
Okay.
I need this hallway clean, please.
I knew something bad happened in that apartment.
Melissa, go over there, please. Melissa, go over there. Please go over there. Please go.
But it wasn't confirmed to me until the medical examiners came out and I overheard them say her time of death. And then that's when I realized that she was gone.
My condolences to you, okay? We're going to work this hard, and we're going to do everything we can to find out what happened.
The detectives start by asking Melissa about Darlene's ex-boyfriend, Corey.
How long were they together?
I want to say like maybe 3 years, on and off. They would argue and then they would get back on good terms again. He would bribe her with gifts and stuff and to try to get back on her good side all the time.
He was a manipulator. He was one of those that thought that he could always fix the situation with buying gifts or sending a dozen roses to her work.
But then it always, go back to the same thing.
He was displaying jealous behavior.
For her to be controlled by someone wasn't the ideal relationship she would want to be in.
So it's just not been a very stable relationship.
When someone does that, when they try to shower you with gifts, none of these gifts, none of the showering that I'm showing is helping whatever we broke up for in the first place, right? This person is not fixing the issue at hand. It's the smoke and mirrors.
Finally, Melissa says, a few months ago, Darlene told Corey enough is enough.
She had told him that they were over.
But she hadn't cut him out of her life completely.
She wanted to stay friends. That's who she was.
So Melissa says it wasn't surprising when Darlene told her she was going off to Salt Lake to see Corey.
She flew out to Utah to spend time with him.
But while she was there, Corey explained that he had lost his job and was going back home to Houston.
She allowed him to come back into her home, and she still allowed him to stay there while he didn't have a job or got back on his feet. I didn't think it was a good idea, but Darlene was a very strong-minded person. She was going to do what she wanted to do.
However, there was one complication. Darlene's new boyfriend, Marcus.
They've been seeing each other for a couple months.
And did the ex know about him?
I think he knew about him. Marcus knew that Darlene was going to Utah. And when they came back, he knew that Corey was moving in to Darlene's apartment while he got back on his feet.
But according to Melissa, Marcus had no reason to be jealous of Corey.
Darlene wasn't staying at the apartment with Corey. She was staying with Marcus.
It's definitely sounding like a love triangle situation.
Or is it? Because according to Melissa, Corey and Marcus weren't the only men in Darlene's life.
There was another person who she'd also been dating.
What is his name?
I don't know his real name.
She only knows that people call him JR.
Detectives investigating the murder of Darlene Solis have uncovered 3 possible suspects. Her ex, Corey Campbell, her new boyfriend, Marcus Jennings, and another man that her friends only know as JR.
Darlene met JR while she was out one night with her friends, and they hit it off right away while they were out. They exchanged phone numbers and I guess just kept in contact.
According to Melissa, it was more of a fling than a full-blown relationship.
He was very young. He was way younger than her, so that's someone that she wasn't going to take serious, but just kind of wanted him as a friend because she did enjoy his company.
But now that Darlene is dead, the detectives have to wonder, had JR wanted more from the relationship?
Perhaps JR got spurned.
Naturally, the police are going to look into who's JR? Who is this person? What's his story?
Darlene! Darlene!
But before they can, one of the 3 men in Darlene's life arrives on the scene.
Marcus showed up because he had been told something had happened to Darlene.
he heard nothing from her, and that was just so uncharacteristic of Darlene that a lot of people started getting concerned.
At least that's what Marcus tells the detectives.
Just tell me everything. I'll ask you some questions that may be uncomfortable, but we want to find out.
He's very cooperative. He's willing to tell him anything.
However, he mostly wanted to tell them about Darlene's complicated relationship with her ex-boyfriend, Corey Campbell.
He got fired from his work, so
he got let go from his job.
She came back and she said she's gonna let him stay until he found a fix.
Darlene had a kind heart, and she felt sorry for her ex.
She just letting him stay there.
I didn't really. She said that's what she was doing.
Marcus said that Darlene more or less moved in with him while Corey crashed at her place.
She would stay with Marcus, and then she would just go home, grab some clothes, shower, get ready, and then leave again.
She said she wasn't trying to work nothing out with him no more.
Still, Marcus admits he wasn't crazy about the arrangement. But he also knew not to push it.
It was still a newer relationship. He felt that he and Darlene were not at that point yet where he should or could dictate kind of what her choices were.
I didn't want to ask too much.
But Marcus says that the more Darlene told him about Corey, the less he liked the situation.
She said that he was trying to argue.
They're arguing? Okay.
According to Marcus, Corey had been trying to get Darlene to take him back.
But he says Darlene wasn't interested.
She was just feeling sorry for him.
And he says as the tension grew, he urged her not to go back to her place.
He said, I'll go buy you clothes, I'll go buy you makeup. You don't have to go back.
But according to Marcus, Darlene wouldn't listen.
She said, that's my place. I'm going and leaving when I want. She was a little hard-headed as well.
According to Marcus, he last saw Darlene on Tuesday, roughly 48 hours before police found her body.
She stayed with me.
Okay.
I brought her back on Tuesday around noon.
He also says they made plans for her to come over to his place again that night.
I called her probably around 3 or 4 that day, and then she said, I might be ready, and after that, she didn't answer the phone no more.
Marcus says he didn't think anything bad had happened to Darlene, just that she was avoiding him.
He's like, I figured maybe she changed her mind and decided to stay with him.
I really didn't.
But now the question for detectives is whether or not Marcus is giving them the whole story.
He answers all the questions, and so that in and of itself doesn't eliminate a suspect, but I mean, it's a good sign. Thank you, Marcus.
Then, after talking to Marcus, the detectives try to track down the third man in Darlene's life.
Darlene's friend Melissa had JR's number, so detectives were able to reach him by phone.
It turns out his name is Joey Reed.
Hello? Look, your name came up during our investigation, and I guess you're an acquaintance of Darlene.
Yes, sir.
He describes his relationship with Darlene as a casual one.
It was like more of a friends with benefits type of relationship. Just nothing so serious, but we're just having fun and day by day.
JR's account aligns with what Darlene's friend Melissa told detectives about the relationship.
Although JR says he hadn't seen Darlene in over a week on account of the Corey situation.
What did she tell you about that?
Basically, that she was just trying to get rid of him.
According to JR, Corey was bad news.
JR described Corey as this toxic person.
Y'all be saying, that was crazy.
Hey, you can't leave me. You hear me? You just can't.
Joey Reed, who says he was only casually dating Darlene Solis, has told the detectives investigating her murder that Darlene had problems with her ex-boyfriend, Corey Campbell.
She mentioned that, man, he's crazy. He'll knock on my door and just keep knocking.
It just wasn't like somebody in love. It's more like somebody obsessed.
Darlene! Corey just wasn't ready to let their relationship go.
He was gonna plan some sympathy move on her. Like, if you leave me, I'll kill myself if you ever leave me.
Hey, you can't leave me. You hear me? You just can't.
JR claims that in addition to threatening to kill himself, Corey had broken into Darlene's apartment before moving to Utah.
He wasn't there when she got home, but Darlene knew it was him.
Rick Don is like trashing the place.
She told you about that?
I mean, I was there that.
Her makeup was on the floor. Her bed sheets were on the floor. Her closet was just everywhere. It was a big mess.
I was just like, damn, that guy's going crazy like this.
He told her that she needed to make a police report just to have that in writing, showing that he did that.
And since she refused to put charges on him, even though everybody told her to.
She just felt bad. She didn't want to put him in a bad position.
But does that mean Corey was Darlene's killer?
It's possible that JR or Marcus could have been pointing the finger at Corey to divert suspicion from themselves.
Police absolutely made sure to keep that in consideration.
However, the detectives also have reason to suspect that JR and Marcus are telling the truth.
Everything has pointed back to Corey, his jealous behavior, and he had opportunity. I mean, he was living there in the apartment.
And unlike Marcus or JR, Corey is nowhere to be found.
Additional interviews with Darlene's family and friends only add to the suspicion that Corey Campbell was behind the murder.
There were conversations that Darlene had with her closest friends about Corey's aggression, and that Corey was not willing or ready to let go.
He was doing little things to let her know, I'm still here.
He would call her up and text her when she's out with her friends, say, what are you doing?
That all added to this general theme of the possessive and aggressive nature that Corey had with Darlene.
And when detectives sit down with Darlene's mother, she tells them that she had been worried about Corey for some time.
When he broke into her apartment, I kind of realized that he was not good for her.
It's like there's this whole other side to him that no one knows about.
Darlene's mother also says she had warned her daughter about letting Corey back into her life.
I told her, there's no reason for him to be staying at your apartment. And that last day that I saw her, I told her, you need to tell him he needs to move out.
He had the ability to go back home, to get somewhere to stay, but it all goes back to power and control. I can control how she views me and how she sees me. She's going to see me as vulnerable and can play on her emotions and allow me to have control over her by being in her space and taking up her space.
But while Darlene's mother says she thought Corey was taking advantage of her daughter, she never suspected he would actually hurt Darlene.
I would have never thought that he would have done that.
I don't think anyone thought that Corey Campbell was capable of this.
It's like there's a different side of him that we don't know about.
And when the detectives received the forensics results from the crime scene, they further suggest that Corey was capable of murder.
The handgun that was discovered under the bed came back as being purchased and owned by Corey Campbell.
Ballistics was able to figure out that was the murder weapon.
Now all the detectives have to do is find him.
This is somebody who fled and should be considered extremely dangerous.
But the manhunt has barely begun when detectives get a call from a sheriff in Forsyth County, North Carolina.
The sheriff tells detectives they were tipped off by someone at a local attorney's office that Corey was in town.
He fled Houston and he went to North Carolina to where his mom and daughter lived.
This guy came into the law firm today with his mother and was saying that he think he killed the girl in Houston.
Detectives investigating Darlene Solis's murder have a lead on the whereabouts of their prime suspect, Corey Campbell.
They received word from a sheriff in North Carolina that Corey had turned up at a local law firm seeking representation.
A friend of mine is a friend of one of the lawyers in that law firm that he showed up at with his mother.
Okay.
And what was said to the friend of mine from one of the lawyers that was there was that this guy showed up from Texas saying that he shot a deputy's daughter.
Darlene's stepfather is a Harris County, Texas sheriff's deputy.
The police start working with the authorities in North Carolina to get Corey back here to Houston.
We might be able to get a full-blown charge and warrant for murder issued on him tomorrow, and then we'll just let you guys locate him.
The officers that were involved out in North Carolina were ready to make sure that Corey was held accountable.
The next day, with warrants in hand, North Carolina authorities take Corey into custody.
That was a big relief. I'm like, finally, we're getting justice for Darlene. It was like the best news that we had received.
24 hours later, the Houston detectives sit down with Corey for the first time.
And they flew out to North Carolina to try to further the investigation.
I mean, it's up to you. Either you want to talk to us or not. If not,
Okay, I'm not allowed without my attorney. One of my attorneys being pleased.
you can do what you want.
I mean, that's certainly everybody's right, but it can be irritating.
Still, the flight isn't entirely a waste.
While detectives are in North Carolina, they're contacted by the pastor where Corey's mom goes to church.
His mom, she called me, and she was hysterical and upset and said she needed to talk to me.
He says that Corey's mom then put her son on the phone.
He said, "Yo, what's up, man?" He was with Becky, and I said, "Hey, what's going on?" And he said, "Some stuff jumped off or whatever." He said, "I just need prayer." So I told him, I said, "I'll pray for you." I said, "But what's going on?" And he said, "One thing led to another, man, and then my girlfriend, we got into it. It just happened." And I said, "What happened?" I said, "Did you kill him?" He said, "Yeah."
Instead of going to the police, he went to a pastor and he was confessing to what he's done.
He said, "Yeah, I popped off like 3 times, you know what I'm saying?" And I said, what do you mean popped off? Popped off what? And he says, "I shot him."
And he's talking to him matter-of-factly, not really seemingly showing any sorrow over what he's done.
I said, "Do you know for a fact that she's dead?" He said, "Yes, she did." I said, "Well, how do you know she's dead?" He said, "Well, I shot her in the back of the head."
The pastor says he'd urged Corey to go to the police.
I said, "Yeah, you need to be a man. If you kill her, you need to take yourself in."
When he heard Corey had been arrested, the pastor contacted detectives himself.
I cannot, as a pastor, as a human being, know something like that and sit on the information.
Corey is extradited back to Texas, And when he finally goes on trial for Darlene's murder in April of 2023, the prosecution portrays him as a jealous ex who refused to let go.
So, you gonna stay in tonight so we can hang out?
Come on, Corey.
What? I just want to spend time with you.
Darlene was simply trying to help him get back on his feet. And the fact that she had already told him we're not getting back together and that she was actively dating someone was one of the final breaking points for Corey to finally realize that he didn't have a chance.
Despite that, the prosecutors believe that on the day of the murder, Corey pleaded with Darlene to take him back.
Honestly, I think it's time for you to look for your own place. This is not working out.
Please.
I told you it wasn't gonna happen this time.
She said she didn't want to be with him anymore.
It didn't matter what he did or what he bought her. She was going to leave his life and he couldn't take it.
You don't mean that.
I do. I'm sorry, but I do.
Don't walk away from me.
Corey was much more possessive and aggressive than a lot of people knew.
He did not see her as a human. He saw her as a possession, and he therefore took action to get control over his possession, which resulted in her death.
Just like the story we've heard millions of times before. It's, I'll have her or nobody will have her.
Then he'd stashed the gun under the bed and fled the scene.
A lot of these types of crimes are passionate crimes, and they're not really well thought out.
When it's the defense's turn, Corey's attorneys put him on the stand.
When Corey took the stand, the defense's position was that there was essentially an accidental discharge during the struggle of a gun that led to the death of Darlene.
His story wasn't adding up. Darlene was a tiny girl.
They were trying to say that Darlene could somehow overpower Corey, that her finger was on the trigger and it went off 2 or 3 more times after she sustained a headshot. And we pointed out all the contradictions and inconsistencies in that statement. Stories about his possessive and aggressive nature. I think it really presented a picture to the jury of who Corey truly was.
When the jury returns with a verdict, it's clear they agree with the prosecution's take.
They found him guilty of murder.
He was sentenced to 40 years, and he has to serve at least half of that before he becomes eligible for parole.
That just kind of isn't fair for the family that he only got 40 years and didn't get life. But I thank God for the guilty verdict.
When you lose someone that way, nothing feels like justice, right? No amount of time, no amount of sentencing, because at the end of the day, I still do not have this person that you took away from me.
All Darlene's friends and family can do in her absence is hope that her story can prevent others from suffering a similar fate.
It's important for victims to realize that they are in an abusive relationship. But a part of that is cutting all contact, because as long as they have that contact or connection to you, they will use that as a way to play on your vulnerabilities.
It may be painful at first, but in the long run, you'll be glad you did it, and the alternative could be very tragic.
I miss her just calling me and asking me if I was okay, if I needed anything, asking me to do things with her. I miss her personality. I just miss everything about Darlene.
She was courageous. She had a lot of love to give, a lot of love. And she would brighten up your day. I'll be grieving for her loss for the rest of my life.
April 24th, 2018, began like any other spring morning in Citrus Heights, California. The quiet neighborhood slowly awakened beneath a pale sky, where trimmed lawns glistened with dew and sprinklers hissed across small patches of green grass. Garbage bins stood neatly beside driveways. A dog barked somewhere in the distance before falling silent again. Neighbors prepared for another ordinary Tuesday, exchanging brief waves before leaving for work, never imagining that history was about to unfold only a few houses away. Behind the walls of an aging suburban home lived a 72-year-old man, who had blended into the neighborhood for decades. He had gray hair, a tired posture, and the appearance of someone settling into retirement after a lifetime of ordinary responsibilities. He had once served in the United States Navy. Later, he had worn the badge of a California police officer. After leaving law enforcement, he worked quietly as a mechanic at a supermarket distribution center. He had raised 3 daughters. To those who knew him only in passing, he was simply another aging resident with a temper that occasionally flared over barking dogs or neighborhood disputes. Nothing about his appearance hinted at the nightmare hidden beneath the surface. For more than 40 years, detectives, victims, journalists, and entire communities had searched for a ghost. He had been given many names, because no one realized they were all hunting the same man. In Visalia, he was known as the Visalia Ransacker, a mysterious prowler who slipped into homes without warning, disturbing families in ways that made little sense. In Sacramento, terrified women whispered about the East Area Rapist, a predator who transformed peaceful neighborhoods into places where every creaking floorboard sounded like the beginning of another attack. Along the coast of Southern California, investigators searched desperately for the original Night Stalker, a killer whose brutality seemed impossible to predict. For years, these names existed as separate nightmares. Different counties. Different detectives. Different victims. Different investigations. No one realized that one man stood at the center of every chapter. His crimes stretched across more than a decade, crossing hundreds of miles of California highways while leaving behind shattered families and unanswered questions. At least 13 people were murdered. Around 50 women were sexually assaulted. More than 120 homes were invaded. Many investigators believed those numbers represented only the crimes that could be proven. The real total might never be known. Every victim carried invisible scars that lasted far longer than newspaper headlines. Some lost their lives. Others survived only to spend decades waking in the middle of the night, convinced they had heard footsteps outside a bedroom window. Children grew into adults with memories they could never fully explain. Husbands lived with unbearable guilt, remembering the helplessness forced upon them while someone else controlled every second inside their own homes. The man responsible disappeared as completely as he had appeared. Time continued moving forward. Children became parents. Parents became grandparents. Police officers retired. Case files gathered dust. The world changed around those unsolved crimes. Technology advanced beyond anything detectives of the 1970s could have imagined. DNA science transformed criminal investigations. The internet connected millions of people. Surveillance cameras became common. Entire generations grew up without recognizing the names that had once filled California newspapers with fear. Yet somewhere, hidden among millions of ordinary Americans, the killer simply kept living. Perhaps he mowed his lawn on weekends. Perhaps he attended family dinners. Perhaps he smiled politely at strangers inside grocery stores. Perhaps he watched television reports discussing his own crimes without revealing the slightest hint of emotion. That possibility haunted investigators more than almost anything else. The idea that evil did not always hide behind monstrous faces had challenged detectives throughout history. Sometimes it wore uniforms. Sometimes it raised children. Sometimes it paid taxes, complained about neighbors, and blended into the rhythm of suburban life so perfectly that even the people living next door never suspected they were sharing a street with one of America's most prolific serial offenders. The greatest predators rarely looked like monsters. They looked familiar. That truth would become impossible to ignore once the identity of the Golden State Killer was finally revealed. But before investigators reached that extraordinary moment, they first had to survive decades of frustration, disappointment, and heartbreak. Every promising lead eventually collapsed. Every suspect was eliminated. Every breakthrough dissolved into another dead end. Detectives spent entire careers chasing someone they could describe only through fragments collected from terrified survivors. A flashlight beam. A whisper in the darkness. The smell of damp gloves. Heavy breathing behind a bedroom door. Footsteps disappearing into the night. Victims described a man who moved with frightening confidence. He seemed to know the layout of their homes better than they did. He understood police response times. He anticipated panic before it happened. He could vanish into darkness before officers even reached the neighborhood. It often felt as though he knew exactly how investigators thought. Years later, that disturbing impression would suddenly make perfect sense. Because he had once been one of them. Long before the public learned his name, Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. had sworn an oath as a police officer. He learned patrol procedures, criminal investigations, evidence preservation, and tactical response. He understood radio communications. He knew how officers searched neighborhoods after emergency calls. He recognized investigative patterns because he had participated in them himself. Whether every crime benefited directly from that training remains impossible to prove. But many investigators believed it gave him a devastating advantage. He was hunting people who trusted the police while understanding precisely how the police hunted men like him. That imbalance helped create one of the longest-running manhunts in American criminal history. As years turned into decades, surviving victims slowly accepted the painful possibility that justice might never arrive. Some detectives refused to surrender hope, carefully preserving biological evidence collected from crime scenes despite the limitations of forensic science during the 1970s and 1980s. At the time, those samples offered little practical value. There was no national DNA database capable of identifying an unknown offender. There were no advanced genetic genealogy techniques waiting just beyond the horizon. Still, some investigators insisted on protecting every piece of evidence. Not because they knew how it would help, but because they believed one day, somehow, science would catch up to the killer. That quiet faith would eventually change everything. The breakthrough that finally exposed the Golden State Killer was not born from luck alone. It was built upon thousands of hours of patient detective work carried across generations. Officers who never met one another unknowingly contributed pieces to a puzzle spanning more than 40 years. Detectives inherited boxes of reports written before they had even entered law enforcement. Crime scene technicians preserved evidence without realizing that future technology would unlock secrets impossible to imagine at the time. Every forgotten report. Every carefully labeled envelope. Every preserved DNA sample. Every victim willing to relive unimaginable trauma during another interview. Together, they kept the investigation alive long after many believed it belonged only in history books. On that calm April morning in 2018, none of the neighbors standing outside their homes could see the invisible weight carried by the officers approaching a modest residence in Citrus Heights. They were not simply preparing to arrest an elderly man. They were preparing to confront a ghost that had haunted California for more than 4 decades. Within minutes, one of the greatest mysteries in modern criminal history would begin to unravel. And with it, a nation would finally discover that the monster it had imagined for 40 years had been hiding in plain sight all along. For decades, the Golden State Killer had existed as something almost mythical, a shadow that seemed to belong more to nightmares than to reality. His story had been passed from one generation of detectives to another like an unfinished chapter no one could close. Young investigators entered law enforcement hearing the name spoken, with equal parts determination and frustration. Older detectives remembered the sleepless nights, the frantic radio calls, and the desperate hope that every new lead might finally end the terror. Instead, year after year, the file grew thicker while the trail grew colder. California itself had changed beyond recognition during those 40 years. Entire neighborhoods where the attacks once occurred looked different now. Empty fields had become shopping centers. Quiet residential streets had filled with larger homes and heavier traffic. Families who once lived in fear had either moved away or grown old inside the same houses where unimaginable violence had unfolded. Children who had been warned never to leave windows unlocked were now grandparents telling stories about a time when everyone believed evil only existed somewhere else. Yet those memories never completely disappeared. Some survivors admitted they still checked every door before going to bed, even after decades had passed. Others could not sleep unless every curtain was tightly closed. A few refused to live in single-story homes ever again, because they could never forget how easily someone had entered through a bedroom window. Time had softened many things. It had not softened fear. What made the crime so psychologically devastating was not only the violence itself, but the complete destruction of the idea that home was a safe place. The attacker did not choose dark alleyways or abandoned buildings. He entered ordinary houses in peaceful neighborhoods, often selecting couples who believed they were safest inside their own bedrooms. He turned comfort into vulnerability. He turned silence into terror. He turned familiar surroundings into permanent reminders of trauma. Many victims later described the same unbearable realization. The attack did not end when the offender walked away. It continued every evening when darkness settled outside. Every unfamiliar sound became a possible threat. Every barking dog, every creaking floorboard, every branch brushing against a window carried the power to drag them back into the longest night of their lives. For investigators, the emotional burden became equally overwhelming. Each new crime scene looked hauntingly familiar. Detectives recognized the patterns almost immediately. The bindings, the methodical movements through the house, the calculated psychological control, the confidence. Whoever this man was, he was not improvising. He followed routines with disturbing consistency, suggesting someone who had committed similar crimes many times before. Patterns are often the greatest weakness of serial offenders. In this case, they also became his greatest strength. The consistency connected the investigations, but it also demonstrated how disciplined the offender truly was. He rarely acted impulsively. He studied his victims. He prepared carefully. He adapted whenever law enforcement introduced new strategies. Every time investigators believed they understood him, he shifted locations, or altered his behavior just enough to remain invisible. The chase became a game measured not in days or weeks, but in years. Then decades. Reporters continued writing stories. Television programs revisited the mystery. Amateur investigators developed countless theories. Some believed the offender had died. Others insisted he had moved overseas. A few wondered whether he had been imprisoned under another identity for an unrelated crime. No one imagined that he had simply stopped. That possibility was perhaps the most unsettling of all. Could someone capable of such extraordinary violence simply wake up one morning and decide never to kill again? Psychologists debated the question repeatedly. Some argued that age eventually reduced his physical ability to continue committing the crimes. Others believed changing family circumstances may have influenced his behavior. There were endless theories, but very few answers. The only certainty was that the attacks had ceased. The silence that followed became almost as mysterious as the crimes themselves. For every anniversary of an unsolved murder, another family waited. For every birthday missed by a victim, another investigator reopened old photographs. For every Christmas spent with an empty chair at the dinner table, another survivor wondered whether justice would ever arrive before it was too late. Hope became difficult. But it never disappeared completely. Inside evidence storage rooms across California, carefully preserved biological samples waited inside sealed containers. Most people never thought about those boxes. They were stored quietly, catalogued carefully, and protected through countless departmental moves, budget cuts, and changes in leadership. Those small pieces of evidence represented something extraordinary. They represented possibility. The detectives who first collected them during the 1970s could not have predicted the future. They had no idea that science would one day read genetic information with astonishing precision. They simply understood one fundamental principle of investigation. Never throw away evidence. One day, it might matter. That simple decision became one of the most important acts of patience in modern criminal history. As forensic science advanced during the late 20th century, investigators slowly eliminated suspect after suspect through DNA comparisons. Each exclusion narrowed the possibilities, but never produced the answer everyone wanted. The profile belonged to someone who had never been entered into criminal databases. The killer had somehow avoided being caught for any offense serious enough to require DNA collection. He remained anonymous, invisible, untouchable. Then a revolutionary idea emerged. Instead of searching directly for the offender, investigators could search for his relatives. The concept sounded almost impossible. Every human being inherits DNA from previous generations. Distant cousins, great-grandparents, and extended family members all leave faint genetic connections that can sometimes be traced through public genealogy databases created by ordinary people researching their family history. No one had successfully used the technique on a case of this scale before. It carried uncertainty. It carried ethical questions. It also carried hope. Among the investigators determined to explore this new frontier was Paul Holes, a detective who had spent years refusing to let the Golden State Killer investigation disappear into history. Alongside dedicated genealogists, forensic scientists, and other investigators, he helped pursue an entirely new path toward identifying a man who had escaped traditional police work for more than 4 decades. The process was painstaking. Family trees stretched across generations. Names appeared, disappeared, and reappeared. Birth certificates, marriage records, military records, census documents. Every branch had to be examined. Every possibility had to be tested. Months of research slowly reduced thousands of names to hundreds. Hundreds became dozens. Dozens became only a handful. Eventually, one name demanded closer attention. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. His age matched. His locations matched. His background raised immediate interest. Most importantly, his life intersected repeatedly with places connected to the crimes. Still, suspicion alone meant nothing. Investigators needed certainty. They could not risk accusing the wrong man after 40 years of unanswered questions. So they watched. Without attracting attention, surveillance teams observed his daily routine. They noted where he drove, when he left home, and how he interacted with the world around him. To everyone passing by, he appeared exactly as neighbors had always described him, an elderly retiree living an ordinary suburban existence. There were no dramatic confrontations. No obvious signs of guilt. Only patience. The investigation had waited more than 40 years. It could wait a little longer. Eventually, detectives collected DNA from items he had discarded. They also obtained genetic material from objects he had touched during routine activities outside his home. The samples were delivered to forensic laboratories with extraordinary care. Then everyone waited. The comparison would either eliminate the leading suspect or end one of the longest manhunts in American history. When the results arrived, they were unmistakable. The DNA matched the biological evidence preserved from crime scenes committed decades earlier. The ghost finally had a name. The monster finally had a face. Everything investigators had pursued for more than 4 decades suddenly became real. The arrest itself lasted only moments. Years of investigation. Thousands of interviews. Millions of pages of reports. Hundreds of detectives. Dozens of victims. 40 years of uncertainty. All of it led to a quiet suburban street, where an elderly man was taken into custody, without the dramatic resistance many people expected. The simplicity of that moment felt almost surreal. Television cameras quickly filled the neighborhood. News spread across the United States and then around the world. Survivors received phone calls they had almost stopped believing would ever come. Families who had buried loved ones decades earlier finally heard words they feared they would never hear. "We found him." Those 3 words carried the emotional weight of 40 years. For some victims, they brought tears. For others, they brought silence. Justice had arrived, but it could never restore the lives that had been stolen, or erase the memories left behind. It could only answer the question that had haunted California for generations. Who was he? The answer shocked almost everyone. He was not hiding in another country. He was not living under a false identity. He had not vanished into the wilderness. He had spent decades living among ordinary people, quietly blending into suburban life, while one of the darkest secrets in American criminal history remained locked behind an ordinary front door. The story of the Golden State Killer is not simply the story of one serial offender. It is the story of hundreds of lives forever changed, of investigators who refused to surrender, of scientific breakthroughs that rewrote the future of criminal investigations, and of a truth that remained buried for more than 4 decades before finally emerging into the light. To understand how one man managed to terrorize an entire state for so long, we must return to the beginning, long before the nation knew the name Golden State Killer, when the first cracks in an ordinary California community appeared, almost too small for anyone to recognize that history's most notorious predators had already begun his hunt. The story begins years before newspapers coined terrifying nicknames, and before investigators realized they were chasing one offender across hundreds of miles of California. It begins in a state that, during the early 1970s, represented opportunity, prosperity, and the promise of a better life. California was expanding rapidly. New housing developments appeared almost overnight, stretching across fertile valleys and quiet suburbs. Young families left crowded cities in search of peaceful neighborhoods where children could ride bicycles until sunset, and neighbors still greeted one another by name. Sacramento's eastern suburbs embodied that dream. Rows of modest ranch-style homes lined tree-covered streets. Freshly planted lawns reflected the optimism of families buying their first houses. Swing sets stood in backyards. Station wagons filled driveways after the evening commute. On warm summer nights, windows remained open to let cool air drift through bedrooms while the distant hum of sprinklers blended with the sounds of crickets. People believed they had found safety. Doors were sometimes left unlocked. Children walked to school without constant supervision. Neighbors borrowed tools from one another without hesitation. The greatest concerns were usually unpaid bills, broken appliances, or deciding where to spend the weekend. Crime existed, of course, but it belonged somewhere else. It happened in distant parts of large cities, not in communities where everyone recognized familiar faces at the grocery store. That shared confidence would become one of the killer's greatest weapons. Long before the murders began, another series of strange crimes unfolded nearly 200 miles south in the city of Visalia. At first glance, they appeared almost insignificant compared to the violent offenses that would later dominate national headlines. Residents awoke to discover someone had entered their homes during the night. Nothing particularly valuable was missing. Cash remained untouched. Jewelry stayed inside bedroom drawers. Televisions and expensive electronics sat exactly where they had been left. Instead, the intruder seemed fascinated by objects that made little financial sense. Family photographs disappeared. Old coins vanished. Small keepsakes were taken without explanation. Children's belongings were sometimes moved from one room to another. Drawers had been opened and carefully searched before being closed again. Furniture had shifted only a few inches. Closets showed signs that someone had quietly stood inside them. The burglar seemed less interested in stealing than in invading. Police initially treated the incidents as unusual property crimes. Every city experiences burglars, and most eventually make mistakes that lead to arrest. Detectives believed patience would solve the mystery. Instead, the incidents multiplied. Night after night, more families reported unexplained intrusions. The offender demonstrated remarkable confidence. He entered occupied homes while residents slept only a few feet away. Sometimes victims later realized someone had been inside without waking them at all. Other families remembered hearing faint noises, but dismissed them as ordinary sounds created by old houses settling after dark. By sunrise, someone had already been inside every room. The psychological impact became far greater than the financial loss. People stopped asking what had been stolen. They started asking something far more disturbing. How long had he been watching us? That question lingered over every investigation. The offender often displayed knowledge that should have been impossible unless he had spent considerable time studying his targets beforehand. He appeared to understand family routines with unsettling accuracy. He entered homes when everyone was asleep. He avoided unexpected visitors. He disappeared moments before anyone became aware of his presence. Some investigators wondered whether he was simply lucky. Others suspected something much darker. Perhaps he had already been inside the neighborhood many times before. Perhaps he had watched from parked vehicles. Perhaps he had hidden in nearby fields or behind fences, quietly observing families who believed they were completely alone. Those theories became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Meanwhile, life continued normally across California. Children attended school. Parents planned vacations. Local newspapers devoted greater attention to sports and politics than to the strange burglar haunting Visalia. Few people outside the immediate community paid much attention. No one imagined these break-ins represented the opening chapter of one of America's longest criminal investigations. As detectives studied the reports, certain behavioral patterns emerged. The offender rarely rushed. He seemed comfortable remaining inside homes for extended periods. Instead of grabbing the first valuable object available and escaping, he wandered from room to room with extraordinary patience. He opened personal letters. He examined family photographs. He searched through intimate possessions that held emotional rather than monetary value. Modern criminal profilers would later recognize those behaviors as deeply significant. The crime suggested someone who derived satisfaction from invading private lives. The burglary itself appeared secondary. Control, surveillance, and psychological domination seemed far more important than financial reward. At the time, however, behavioral profiling remained in its infancy. Most investigators focused on practical questions. Who was entering the homes? How was he avoiding detection? Why couldn't anyone identify him? The answers remained frustratingly out of reach. Witnesses occasionally reported seeing a young white male moving through neighborhoods late at night. Others described hearing footsteps on rooftops, or observing someone running through backyards after midnight. Several homeowners chased suspicious figures only to lose them in darkness. Descriptions varied enough to create uncertainty. Some believed the offender was athletic. Others thought he appeared average. No reliable identification emerged. It was almost as though the intruder intentionally avoided leaving lasting impressions. Even his movements demonstrated careful planning. Rather than relying on vehicles that might attract attention, he often escaped on foot, weaving through drainage canals, parks, open fields, and narrow pathways unfamiliar to responding officers. By the time patrol cars surrounded an area, he had already disappeared. His confidence suggested experience. He seemed comfortable navigating neighborhoods in complete darkness. He understood which streets received little traffic. He knew where fences could be climbed quickly. He anticipated how frightened homeowners would react after discovering an intrusion. Every successful escape increased his confidence. Every unsolved burglary taught him another lesson. Every investigation revealed more about police procedures. Although investigators could not yet see the larger picture, the offender himself appeared to be evolving. Criminal behavior often develops gradually rather than appearing fully formed. Many serial offenders begin with less violent crimes before escalating over time. Each successful offense reduces fear, increases confidence, and reinforces dangerous fantasies. Looking backward decades later, criminologists would describe the Visalia crimes as a period of experimentation. The offender was learning. Learning how long he could remain inside occupied houses. Learning how families responded under stress. Learning which neighborhoods offered the greatest opportunities. Learning how investigators processed crime scenes. Learning how to disappear. Those lessons would later make him extraordinarily difficult to catch. During this same period, another aspect of his personality quietly revealed itself. He possessed remarkable patience. Many criminals act impulsively, driven by immediate opportunity or emotional outbursts. This offender behaved differently. He appeared capable of delaying gratification for days or even weeks while carefully preparing for each intrusion. Investigators would later discover evidence suggesting he frequently conducted surveillance before selecting a target. He observed routines. He noticed when lights turned off. He paid attention to work schedules. He identified possible escape routes long before committing the crime. Such preparation dramatically reduced unpredictability. Very little was left to chance. The discipline displayed during these early burglaries would later become one of the defining characteristics of the Golden State Killer. His crimes were horrifying not only because of their brutality, but because of their organization. Everything appeared calculated. Everything served a purpose. Even the smallest details reflected planning. Yet despite all his preparation, one crucial element remained hidden from investigators. His identity. At the time, No one knew they were searching for a man with military experience, someone accustomed to structure, discipline, and physical endurance. No one knew he had worked in law enforcement and understood investigative methods from the inside. Those revelations belonged to the future. For now, detectives saw only the consequences. Broken window screens. Disturbed bedrooms. Missing keepsakes. Terrified families struggling to explain why someone would invade their homes without taking the obvious valuables. The questions multiplied faster than the answers. Then, slowly and almost imperceptibly, the crimes began to change. The intrusions became bolder. The risks increased. The offender no longer seemed satisfied with entering homes while people slept. He wanted something more. Something far darker. The invisible line separating burglary from violent personal attack was beginning to disappear, and California was about to discover that the mysterious prowler haunting quiet neighborhoods had been preparing for something far worse all along. The transition did not happen overnight. There was no single crime that immediately convinced investigators they were witnessing the evolution of a serial predator. Instead, the change unfolded so gradually that only years later, when every report was laid side by side, did the pattern become painfully clear. The offender was becoming increasingly confident. Each successful intrusion reinforced the belief that he was untouchable. Every escape strengthened his willingness to take greater risks. What had once been a burglar slipping quietly through darkened homes was slowly transforming into someone whose objective extended far beyond entering a house unnoticed. He wanted people to know he had been there. Not immediately, but eventually. He wanted them to wake up and realize that while they had been sleeping peacefully, a complete stranger had walked through the most private corners of their lives. That realization alone became part of the punishment. Victims often described an emotion that was difficult to explain. They did not simply feel robbed. They felt violated. Bedrooms no longer felt like bedrooms. Living rooms no longer felt familiar. Even opening a closet door became an unsettling experience, because they could never stop wondering whether someone had once stood silently inside, watching and waiting. Many families moved away shortly after the break-ins. Some repainted entire homes. Others replaced every lock and window. A few renovated bedrooms completely, hoping that changing the physical surroundings might erase the memories attached to them. It never did. Fear has an extraordinary ability to remain long after physical evidence disappears. Detectives, meanwhile, found themselves chasing someone who seemed almost invisible. Crime scenes offered remarkably little forensic evidence by the standards of the day. Fingerprints were either absent or unusable. Shoe impressions were inconsistent. Witnesses could rarely provide reliable descriptions, because the offender deliberately operated under the cover of darkness. There were moments when officers believed they had come close. Several patrol units responded to reports of suspicious figures running through residential neighborhoods. Search teams combed parks, orchards, irrigation canals, and vacant lots with flashlights cutting through the darkness. Nothing. Police dogs occasionally picked up a scent before losing it near roads or open fields. Nothing. Helicopters were not routinely available for neighborhood searches in every jurisdiction, and communication between agencies remained limited compared to modern standards. The offender exploited every weakness. He understood geography remarkably well. He preferred neighborhoods connected by bicycle trails, drainage systems, parks, or undeveloped land that allowed multiple escape routes. Even when officers flooded an area within minutes, he often vanished before an effective perimeter could be established. Whether that knowledge came from repeated surveillance, professional training, or simple experience, investigators could not yet determine. What they did know was deeply troubling. This was not an amateur. This was someone who planned. Around the same time, California itself was undergoing enormous cultural changes. The optimism of the post-war decades remained, but subtle cracks had begun to appear beneath the surface. Rising crime rates in several cities became frequent topics in local newspapers. Communities debated whether neighborhoods were still as safe as they had once been. Alarm companies began advertising home security systems with increasing urgency. Still, many suburban families resisted the idea that serious violence could reach their streets. They continued sleeping with bedroom windows partially open during warm evenings. Children continued leaving bicycles in front yards. People continued assuming that terrible things happened somewhere else. The offender depended on that assumption. He searched for routine. Routine created predictability. Predictability created opportunity. Investigators later concluded that many victims had unknowingly been observed for days, or even weeks, before becoming targets. The offender appeared fascinated by daily habits. Morning departures for work. Evening walks with the dog. Lights switching off at nearly the same hour every night. Weekend family gatherings. Even the placement of garbage bins may have revealed when people were home or away. Nothing seemed too small to notice. His preparation suggested remarkable discipline. He was not selecting victims at random while driving through neighborhoods. He was choosing them carefully. Watching. Learning. Waiting. One of the most chilling aspects of the investigation emerged from interviews conducted years later with surviving victims. Several remembered strange incidents before the attacks that had seemed meaningless at the time. Someone repeatedly calling before hanging up. A gate left mysteriously open. Footprints beneath a bedroom window. Missing household items that later reappeared in unusual places. Dogs barking late at night without obvious reason. Individually, none of these events proved anything. Together, they painted a disturbing picture of prolonged surveillance. The offender was already entering their lives before committing the crime. He was testing reactions, measuring awareness, studying vulnerability. It was psychological hunting. While investigators struggled to understand his behavior, another important development quietly occurred inside law enforcement itself. Communication between different jurisdictions remained far from perfect. Police departments largely focused on crimes occurring within their own boundaries. Information sharing depended heavily upon telephone calls, mailed reports, personal relationships between detectives, and regional meetings. Sophisticated digital databases did not exist. Instant access to statewide investigative files belonged to the future. As a result, seemingly unrelated cases often remained separated simply because they occurred in different counties. The offender unknowingly benefited from those limitations. One detective might recognize an unusual burglary pattern. Another investigator, miles away, might be examining an equally unusual sexual assault. Without complete information, the connection remained hidden. Years would pass before those fragmented investigations merged into one horrifying narrative. Even experienced detectives occasionally underestimated the significance of behavioral evidence. Today, criminal profiling recognizes escalation as one of the defining characteristics of many serial violent offenders. At the time, however, investigators understandably concentrated on solving the immediate crimes before them. No one wanted to believe that the burglar haunting Visalia could become something far worse. Unfortunately, the offender's fantasies continued evolving. Experts who later studied the case concluded that burglary alone was no longer satisfying whatever psychological needs drove his behavior. Control had become addictive. Risk had become exciting. Every successful intrusion reduced the emotional barrier separating fantasy from violence. He had crossed invisible lines before. Soon he would cross another. The transformation would forever change California. The quiet communities that had worried about unusual burglaries would soon face a predator willing to confront victims directly inside their own homes. The fear would become intensely personal. The violence would become unimaginable. The media would eventually create a new name, because the old one no longer described the crimes accurately. The Visalia ransacker was disappearing. In his place, a far more terrifying figure was emerging. One whose crimes would dominate headlines, overwhelm investigators, and leave an entire generation afraid to close their eyes after dark. The state did not know it yet, but the years between 1976 and 1979 were about to become one of the darkest chapters in California's criminal history. The offender had spent years perfecting his methods. Now he was ready to reveal what he had truly been preparing for all along. By the summer of 1976, fear had found a new address. It no longer lingered only in the quiet streets of Visalia. Instead, it spread north into the suburbs surrounding Sacramento, where neighborhoods built on trust suddenly became hunting grounds for an offender unlike anything California had experienced before. The first victims did not know they had been chosen. They continued living ordinary lives, unaware that someone had already begun studying their routines from a distance. Every morning followed a familiar rhythm. Husbands left for work before sunrise. Wives watered gardens or prepared children for school. Teenagers rode bicycles through peaceful streets lined with towering oak trees. Evenings ended with television glowing softly inside living rooms while families discussed work, homework, and weekend plans. From the outside, nothing seemed unusual. But somewhere nearby, someone was watching. Investigators would later discover that the offender rarely acted without preparation. He did not wander neighborhoods searching randomly for opportunity. Instead, he selected victims carefully, investing time that many criminals would never have considered worthwhile. He observed houses from hidden positions. He memorized daily schedules. He noticed which bedroom lights remained on the latest. He watched which garages opened at predictable hours each morning. He learned where dogs slept. He identified fences that could be climbed quietly. He even paid attention to which windows remained partially open during warm California nights. Every observation reduced uncertainty. Every day of surveillance increased his control. The families themselves never realized they were participating in a routine someone else had designed. Many survivors later remembered seeing unfamiliar cars parked along nearby streets, or noticing a man riding a bicycle through the neighborhood several times in 1 week. Others recalled receiving strange telephone calls where the person on the other end simply breathed before hanging up. At the time, those incidents seemed irritating but harmless. Only after the attacks did they understand their true meaning. Someone had been confirming they were home. Someone had been listening. Someone had already decided. One young couple, whose names would later become known only through court records and investigative files, embodied everything the suburban dream promised. They had recently begun building a life together inside a modest single-story home. Friends described them as hardworking and optimistic. Their evenings were wonderfully ordinary. Dinner after work. Television before bed. Weekend visits with relatives. Long conversations about future plans. There was no reason to believe they were in danger. Like so many others, they trusted the walls around them. They locked the front door before going to sleep. They believed that was enough. It wasn't. The offender had already learned almost everything he needed. He knew when they usually turned off their bedroom light. He knew which side of the house remained hidden from neighboring windows. He knew where the backyard fence offered the easiest access. Most importantly, he knew patience would always defeat urgency. Instead of rushing, he waited. Sometimes for hours. Sometimes longer. Darkness itself became his ally. As midnight approached, neighborhoods transformed. Streetlights cast long shadows across quiet sidewalks. Air conditioners hummed steadily inside houses. The occasional passing car disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. Dogs settled into silence. That silence mattered. It allowed him to hear everything. The opening of a bedroom window. The closing of a garage door. Footsteps inside a hallway. Even conversations drifting through thin curtains. He moved slowly enough that nature itself seemed louder than he was. Branches rustled. Leaves shifted beneath gentle wind. Yet the man crossing backyards remained almost impossible to hear. Unlike impulsive offenders driven by adrenaline, he appeared almost unnaturally calm. Investigators would later conclude that many attacks reflected military-like discipline. Every movement appeared deliberate. Every decision minimized unnecessary risk. He often entered properties from rear fences rather than front walkways. He avoided illuminated areas. He selected routes that offered multiple escape options. Even before stepping inside a home, he had already planned how he would leave it. That level of preparation distinguished him from ordinary burglars. He behaved like someone conducting an operation, rather than committing a spontaneous crime. One of the most chilling discoveries made during later investigations involved his willingness to enter homes long before the attack itself. Several victims eventually realized subtle clues had existed for days. A window that no longer locked correctly. A gate mysteriously left open. Objects moved slightly from their original positions. Police now believe the offender sometimes entered houses during daylight hours when residents were away, not to steal, but to study. He wanted familiarity. He wanted confidence. He wanted to know every hallway before darkness concealed them. Imagine returning home after work, placing groceries on the kitchen counter, greeting your spouse, preparing dinner, and settling into bed without ever realizing that someone had already walked through every room while you were gone. Someone had opened bedroom drawers. Someone had examined family photographs. Someone had quietly memorized the floor plan. The victims lived inside that invisible reality without knowing it. Perhaps that is one of the most disturbing aspects of the Golden State Killer's crimes. The attack often began long before the victims opened their eyes. It began during surveillance. It continued through preparation. The violence itself was only the final stage. Behavioral experts later emphasized that this pattern revealed an offender motivated by domination rather than impulse. Every moment of secret observation strengthened the illusion that he controlled the victims' lives before they ever realized he existed. Control became an obsession. Power became the objective. Money never mattered. Jewelry remained untouched. Wallets often stayed where they were. The satisfaction came from something impossible to measure. The knowledge that he alone understood what was about to happen. As investigators accumulated reports from survivors, another remarkable consistency emerged. The offender frequently attacked couples. Traditional criminal thinking struggled to explain this decision. From a practical standpoint, confronting two adults created greater danger than targeting someone living alone. There were more opportunities for resistance, more chances that neighbors would hear screams, and greater risk of identification. Yet he repeatedly chose couples anyway. The explanation appeared psychological rather than practical. He wanted witnesses. not outside witnesses. He wanted each victim to witness the suffering of the other. That objective multiplied emotional trauma far beyond the physical violence itself. Husbands later described the unbearable agony of hearing their wives cry while being physically unable to intervene. Wives carried equally devastating memories of watching partners threatened with death only a few feet away. The offender engineered those moments intentionally. He understood that helplessness could become a lifelong prison. As summer evenings turned into autumn nights, fear quietly spread through communities that still struggled to understand what they were facing. Residents installed stronger locks. Hardware stores sold increasing numbers of outdoor lights. Neighborhood watch meetings attracted larger crowds. Parents instructed children to report unfamiliar vehicles immediately. Police increased patrols wherever possible. Still, the attacks continued. The offender simply adapted. He changed neighborhoods. He altered schedules. He remained unpredictable enough to stay one step ahead of investigators. The newspapers had not yet fully grasped the scale of the threat, but detectives already sensed something extraordinary was unfolding. This was no longer an isolated series of burglaries. This was the emergence of a predator whose patience, discipline, and psychological sophistication placed him in a category few officers had ever encountered. California's quiet suburbs were about to experience a level of fear that would reshape entire communities, and the man responsible was only beginning to reveal the full extent of his terrifying ritual. When investigators later reconstructed the earliest attacks, they noticed something that almost every survivor shared. The offender seemed to know exactly when fear reached its highest point. He did not rush into violence the moment he entered a house. Instead, he allowed silence to do much of the work for him. The psychological pressure built gradually, minute after minute, until panic became almost unbearable. Many victims woke not because of loud noises, but because something felt wrong. It was the strange sensation that another presence occupied the room. The feeling that someone was watching. The instinct that had quietly warned human beings of danger for thousands of years. Then their eyes adjusted to the darkness. A figure stood beside the bed. Motionless. Masked. Holding a flashlight, whose narrow beam briefly swept across terrified faces before disappearing again. For several seconds, neither side moved. The silence itself became a weapon. Only then did the intruder begin speaking. His voice rarely rose above a controlled whisper, forcing victims to listen carefully to every word. Investigators found this detail especially significant. Most armed offenders rely on shouting to establish dominance. This man often did the opposite. The quieter he spoke, the more terrifying he became. His calmness suggested complete confidence. He expected obedience. He expected control. He expected that no one inside the house could stop him. Again and again, survivors described the same overwhelming realization. He was not nervous. He was not improvising. He had done this before. By the time victims understood what was happening, the offender had already taken control of the room. He ordered everyone to lie still. Hands where he could see them. No sudden movements. No screaming. No heroics. The instructions came quickly and with remarkable precision, as though they had been rehearsed countless times. Then came one of the most disturbing rituals ever documented in a serial offender investigation. The man of the house was restrained first. His wrists. His ankles. Sometimes additional bindings secured his movements even further. The offender checked each knot carefully before moving on. Nothing appeared rushed. Everything reflected preparation. The women were restrained separately, ensuring neither victim could help the other. Once both victims had been immobilized, the offender carried out an act that investigators initially struggled to understand. He walked into the kitchen. He returned carrying ordinary household dishes. Plates. Bowls. Drinking glasses. He carefully stacked them across the man's back, while ordering him to remain face down. The message was unmistakable. If the dishes fell, if they made noise, someone would die. Whether the offender truly intended to react every single time remains impossible to know. The psychological effect, however, was devastating. The restrained husband became trapped inside an impossible decision. Move and risk his wife's life. Remain still while listening helplessly. Survivors later described those moments as the longest hours they had ever endured. Every muscle cramped. Every breath felt dangerous. Every tiny shift of body weight threatened to send porcelain crashing onto the floor. The offender understood exactly what he was creating. Absolute helplessness. That ritual became one of the defining signatures connecting dozens of attacks across California. Behavioral experts later suggested that the dishes themselves held symbolic importance. The objects were fragile, ordinary, domestic, items associated with family dinners and peaceful homes. The offender transformed them into instruments of terror. Even years afterward, some survivors admitted they could no longer hear plates clatter together without reliving those nights. Trauma attaches itself to unexpected things. A smell. A sound. A household object. Nothing remains ordinary afterward. During the attacks, the offender often moved freely throughout the house as though he belonged there. He opened refrigerators. He drank beer. He ate food from kitchen cabinets. He wandered into living rooms and examined family photographs hanging on walls. Sometimes he paused to look through personal belongings that had nothing to do with the crime itself. To investigators, those behaviors revealed something deeply unsettling. The house no longer belonged to its owners. For those hours, it belonged to him. The victims existed only because he allowed them to. That illusion of ownership appeared central to his psychological satisfaction. He controlled every room, every conversation, every movement, every second. Long after leaving, he carried with him the knowledge that survivors would never again experience their homes in the same way. Many investigators later commented that the crimes resembled theatrical performances, in which the offender directed every participant according to a carefully rehearsed script. Victims rarely knew what would happen next, because only one person inside the house understood the sequence. Him. That uncertainty intensified the terror. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt endless. Time itself seemed to stop. Outside, entire neighborhoods slept peacefully. A newspaper delivery truck might pass nearby. A late-night driver might stop at a traffic light, only blocks away. Someone walking a dog early in the morning might unknowingly pass the very house where unimaginable fear still unfolded behind closed curtains. The contrast was heartbreaking. Ordinary life continued only a few yards away. Inside, lives were being permanently changed. As detectives interviewed survivor after survivor, another remarkable pattern emerged. The offender appeared unusually aware of police response times. He rarely remained inside longer than circumstances allowed, yet he often stayed much longer than ordinary criminals would dare. That contradiction puzzled investigators. How could someone remain inside occupied homes for such extended periods while consistently escaping before officers arrived? The question produced numerous theories. Perhaps he monitored police radio frequencies. Perhaps he stationed himself where approaching patrol cars could be seen. Perhaps he simply understood how long emergency calls typically required before officers reached suburban neighborhoods. Years later, after his identity became known, many detectives returned to those early reports with fresh eyes. His background in law enforcement suddenly explained details that had seemed almost supernatural decades earlier. He knew procedures because he had once followed them himself. He understood patrol patterns because he had once participated in them. He anticipated investigative decisions because he had been trained to make those same decisions. The realization left many retired investigators stunned. They had unknowingly spent years chasing someone who understood policing from the inside. Meanwhile, public fear continued growing. Local newspapers increasingly devoted front-page coverage to the attacks. Residents organized neighborhood meetings that filled school auditoriums and community centers. Police officers demonstrated home security techniques. Families purchased stronger locks, floodlights, and alarm systems. Gun sales reportedly increased in several affected communities, as frightened homeowners searched desperately for ways to protect themselves. Parents created strict evening rules. Teenagers who once stayed out until late suddenly hurried home before sunset. Children overheard adults whispering about a man who entered houses while people slept. The fear spread faster than the facts. Rumors flourished. Every suspicious stranger became a possible suspect. Every unfamiliar vehicle attracted attention. Every barking dog in the middle of the night caused curtains to open throughout entire neighborhoods. The offender had accomplished something few criminals ever achieve. He had transformed not only individual victims, but entire communities. Trust slowly disappeared. Windows that once remained open during warm evenings were locked tightly. Outdoor lights stayed on until sunrise. Neighbors who had never before questioned unfamiliar faces suddenly watched every passing stranger with suspicion. California's suburban dream had begun to fracture. Yet despite growing public awareness, increased police patrols, and mounting political pressure to make an arrest, the attacks continued. The offender remained unidentified. Invisible. Always one step ahead. Neither investigators nor frightened residents could yet imagine that the violence devastating Sacramento represented only one chapter of a much larger story. The man terrifying Northern California had not reached the end of his evolution. He was still becoming something even more dangerous. The burglar who had once quietly entered empty homes had transformed into a sexual predator capable of extraordinary psychological cruelty. Soon, another invisible boundary would disappear. The man who had already stolen peace from dozens of families would begin stealing lives as well. And when that transformation came, California would discover that the nightmare it thought it understood had only revealed its opening act. The first murders did not erase the fear created by the assaults. They transformed it. For years, surviving victims had lived with the horrifying belief that if they obeyed every command, they might survive until morning. That fragile hope, however unbearable, still existed. The offender's ritual revolved around domination, humiliation, and psychological control. His victims carried lifelong trauma, but many lived to tell investigators what had happened. Then, sometime near the end of the 1970s, something changed. The man who had spent years perfecting his methods crossed another line. This time, there would be no survivors to describe every detail. Only silence. By then, investigators across California already believed they were dealing with one of the most dangerous serial offenders in the state's history. Composite sketches had been distributed. Patrol officers received regular briefings. Citizens attended community meetings packed with frightened families desperate for reassurance that the attacks would stop. Instead, the violence spread. It moved south. It evolved. And it became even more ruthless. The communities along California's coastline looked very different from the suburban neighborhoods surrounding Sacramento. Ocean air drifted through open windows during warm evenings. Palm trees lined quiet residential streets. Beach towns attracted young professionals, newly married couples, and families hoping to build peaceful lives near the Pacific. To outsiders, these communities appeared untouched by the fear-consuming Northern California. Many residents had heard stories about the East Area rapist on television or in newspapers, but the crimes felt distant. Hundreds of miles away. Someone else's nightmare. That illusion would not last. Among those living ordinary lives were couples who shared the same dreams as thousands of others across California. They worked regular jobs, spent weekends with friends, discussed future plans over dinner, and believed their homes represented safety from the outside world. Like the victims before them, they never realized someone had already begun watching. The offender's methods remained remarkably consistent. He selected neighborhoods carefully. He preferred homes offering multiple escape routes. He conducted surveillance before acting. He studied habits. He waited. Patience remained one of his greatest weapons. Behavioral experts later emphasized that this patience reflected extraordinary self-control. Most violent offenders eventually become reckless, because emotion overwhelms planning. The Golden State Killer appeared capable of suppressing impulse, until every circumstance favored him. That discipline made him exceptionally dangerous. On one quiet evening, another couple settled into their nightly routine. Nothing distinguished the day from countless others. Dinner had been finished. Doors had been locked. Lights gradually disappeared throughout the neighborhood. Television programs ended. The house became silent. Outside, darkness settled over the street. Inside, two people believed they had reached the safest part of the day. Sleep. Somewhere beyond the fence line, another person remained awake. He had likely been there before. Perhaps he had walked the neighborhood days earlier pretending to exercise. Perhaps he had ridden a bicycle through nearby streets. Perhaps he had hidden among trees long enough to observe lights switching off one by one. Whatever preparation occurred beforehand, investigators would later conclude that very little happened by chance. He knew where he was going. He knew who was inside. He knew how to enter. The screen covering a rear window offered only minor resistance. He removed it carefully. No sudden movements. No unnecessary noise. Then he disappeared into the darkness inside the home. Everything afterward unfolded with chilling familiarity. The victims awakened. Commands were issued. Restraints appeared. Control was established. But this time the ending would be different. Exactly what occurred during every minute remains unknowable, because no one survived to describe the final sequence of events. Investigators reconstructed the attacks through forensic evidence, blood patterns, witness observations before and after the murders, and the offenders' established behavioral patterns. The evidence painted a devastating picture. Violence escalated dramatically. The offender no longer left after maintaining psychological control. He stayed. The attacks became physically far more brutal. In several cases, victims suffered repeated blows from blunt objects, so severe that investigators immediately recognized overwhelming rage or extreme determination. Yet even those injuries reflected control rather than uncontrolled fury. There was little evidence suggesting chaotic struggle throughout entire houses. The offender maintained dominance until the very end. That detail profoundly affected experienced homicide detectives. It suggested someone emotionally detached enough to carry out murder with calculated purpose. The brutality existed alongside organization. The two were not contradictory. They reinforced each other. Crime scene investigators moved slowly through blood-stained bedrooms illuminated by harsh forensic lights. Every object received careful attention. Photographs documented every angle before evidence technicians touched anything. Measurements were recorded with meticulous precision. In homicide investigations, scenes often tell stories that victims no longer can. This one spoke softly but clearly. The offender understood violence. He understood restraint. He understood exactly how much force he intended to use. Medical examiners worked patiently, documenting injuries that later helped establish connections between seemingly separate murders occurring hundreds of miles apart. Patterns emerged once again. Bindings. Entry methods. Victim selection. Behavior inside the residence. The similarities became impossible to ignore. Although jurisdictions still faced communication challenges, an increasing number of investigators believed they were witnessing the work of the same offender, whose crimes had terrorized Sacramento. The realization brought little comfort. If correct, it meant the offender had become even more dangerous than previously imagined. Communities that once feared surviving an assault now faced an even darker possibility. Death. Families reacted accordingly. Neighborhoods changed almost overnight. Windows disappeared behind heavy security bars. Outdoor floodlights remained illuminated until dawn. Some couples developed routines in which one person stayed awake while the other slept. Others placed makeshift alarms on doors using bells, cans, or glass bottles balanced carefully against entrances. Gun ownership increased further. Hardware stores struggled to keep certain security products in stock. Fear became part of ordinary conversation. Children overheard adults discussing murders during breakfast. Co-workers exchanged rumors over lunch. Neighbors examined unfamiliar footprints with growing suspicion. The psychological impact reached far beyond the immediate victims. The offender had begun reshaping daily life across entire regions of California. For detectives, another disturbing question emerged. Why had he started killing? Serial offender escalation has long fascinated psychologists because motives often evolve over time. Some offenders pursue increasingly extreme experiences as earlier crimes lose psychological satisfaction. Others react to changing personal circumstances or perceived threats of capture. In this investigation, certainty remained impossible. The offender never voluntarily explained his progression during those years. Experts could only analyze behavior. One theory suggested that maintaining complete control over victims eventually became insufficient. Another proposed that murders eliminated witnesses who might later identify him. Others believed the killings represented the fulfillment of fantasies that had been developing since the earliest burglaries in Visalia. Whatever the explanation, the consequences were undeniable. California no longer faced only a serial rapist. It faced a serial killer. And despite mounting public pressure, expanding investigations, and increasingly sophisticated forensic work for that era, no one knew who he was. Somewhere beyond every crime scene, the offender quietly returned to ordinary life. He blended into society with astonishing success. He may have gone to work the following morning. He may have greeted co-workers without attracting attention. He may have smiled politely at strangers buying groceries. The contrast between those ordinary moments and the horror left behind at each crime scene remains one of the most unsettling aspects of the Golden State Killer case. The monster never appeared to think of himself as a monster. He simply disappeared back into everyday life, leaving investigators to search through shattered homes for answers that seemed forever, just beyond their reach. Morning often arrived with heartbreaking normalcy. The sun rose over quiet California neighborhoods exactly as it had the day before. Newspaper delivery drivers completed their routes. Children prepared for school. Garden sprinklers activated automatically. Neighbors stepped outside carrying coffee mugs, expecting another ordinary day. Then someone noticed that something was wrong. Perhaps the front door was standing slightly open. Perhaps a newspaper remained untouched on the driveway long after sunrise. Perhaps a close friend failed to answer repeated telephone calls. Sometimes concern grew slowly. Sometimes it became immediate. In several cases, relatives or neighbors entered the home believing they were checking on loved ones who had simply overslept. Instead, they walked into scenes that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. The first moments inside those houses were often marked by confusion rather than instant understanding. Furniture appeared undisturbed. Nothing suggested a violent burglary motivated by theft. Valuable electronics remained where they belonged. Wallets and jewelry were frequently untouched. Then the silence became overwhelming. Bedrooms revealed what had happened. Patrol officers arriving at these scenes quickly recognized that they were facing something unlike ordinary homicides. Experienced investigators develop an instinct for violence. They learn to distinguish crimes fueled by sudden arguments from those carried out with careful planning. These murders belonged to the second category. There was intention, preparation, method. Nothing suggested panic. Nothing suggested an offender surprised by events inside the house. Instead, every scene reflected someone who had entered with a clear objective and left according to a carefully considered plan. Crime scene photographers documented every detail before evidence technicians began collecting physical evidence. Every footprint in flower beds was measured. Every damaged window screen was preserved. Fibers were lifted from bedding. Biological evidence was collected with painstaking care, even though forensic science had not yet developed the tools that would eventually unlock its greatest secrets. At the time, detectives could only hope that one day technology might advance far enough to answer questions they could not. That hope required remarkable foresight. Evidence that seemed almost useless in the late 1970s would eventually become priceless decades later. Inside briefing rooms across multiple jurisdictions, homicide investigators spread photographs across conference tables. Maps covered entire walls. Colored pins marked attack locations. Dates stretched across timelines that grew longer every month. One question dominated every discussion. Was one man responsible? The similarities continued multiplying. The method of entry. The nighttime attacks. The selection of couples. The bindings. The apparent surveillance beforehand. The psychological control exercised over victims. The absence of significant theft. Even detectives, who initially resisted linking the cases, found the evidence increasingly persuasive. A single offender seemed far more likely than a series of unrelated criminals behaving in nearly identical ways. Yet identifying him remained another matter entirely. The offender left remarkably little behind. He wore gloves. He concealed his face. He avoided unnecessary conversation. He frequently escaped on foot, making vehicle descriptions almost impossible to obtain. Witnesses who glimpsed him outside crime scenes offered only broad estimates. Average height. Lean build. Young adult. Dark clothing. Descriptions too general to identify anyone with confidence. Composite sketches improved public awareness, but generated thousands of tips. Almost all proved useless. Law enforcement agencies found themselves overwhelmed by information. Every suspicious neighbor became a possible lead. Every anonymous phone call demanded attention. Every recently fired employee, former boyfriend, drifter, or military veteran mentioned by frightened citizens had to be investigated. Detectives worked extraordinary hours. Many developed personal attachments to the investigation that extended far beyond professional obligation. They attended victims' funerals. They comforted grieving families. They promised surviving relatives that they would never stop searching. Those promises became difficult to keep. Months passed. Then years. The offender remained invisible. Meanwhile, fear continued reshaping California. Neighborhood watch groups expanded dramatically. Residents organized nightly patrols armed with flashlights, radios, and growing determination. Community centers hosted public meetings where police officers demonstrated burglary prevention techniques and answered anxious questions from hundreds of frightened citizens. Could the attacker strike again tonight? Was he still nearby? Did he live inside the community? No one could provide reassuring answers. The uncertainty proved almost as damaging as the crimes themselves. Families changed lifelong habits. Curtains remained closed after sunset. Children were instructed never to answer the telephone if parents were away. Couples established emergency plans in case someone attempted to enter during the night. Dogs became more than pets. They became early warning systems. Yet even these precautions failed to eliminate fear. The offender possessed one enormous advantage. He chose the time. He chose the place. He chose the victims. Everyone else merely reacted. Behavioral analysts, who later studied the case, noted another deeply disturbing characteristic. The offender appeared to enjoy anticipation almost as much as the crimes themselves. His surveillance suggested emotional investment before each attack. Watching victims unknowingly continue their ordinary routines may have become part of the psychological reward. That conclusion horrified investigators. It meant the violence likely occupied far more of his life than the few hours spent inside each home. The crimes began long before the break-in. They ended long after he escaped. Perhaps while driving to work. Perhaps while sitting alone at home. Perhaps while reading newspaper coverage describing the fear spreading across California. No one can know exactly what he thought. But detectives became convinced that media attention itself may have reinforced his sense of power. Entire communities were changing because of one man. One unidentified offender had forced thousands of people to alter the way they lived. That realization elevated the investigation from a regional crime series to one of the most significant manhunts in the country. State agencies increased cooperation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation offered assistance. Evidence traveled between laboratories. Experienced homicide detectives consulted one another across county lines more frequently than ever before. Still, the essential problem remained unchanged. They knew almost everything about how he committed crimes. They knew almost nothing about who he actually was. Some investigators believed he possessed military training because of his discipline. Others suspected a construction worker familiar with residential neighborhoods. A few argued that only someone connected to law enforcement could repeatedly avoid capture with such consistency. At the time, that final theory sounded almost unbelievable. The idea that a police officer, or former police officer, could secretly terrorize California seemed too disturbing to accept without overwhelming evidence. Ironically, the truth was even more unsettling. While investigators debated competing theories, the offender continued living an apparently ordinary life beyond suspicion. He blended into crowds. He obeyed traffic laws. He shopped in local stores. He spoke with neighbors. Everyday normality became his greatest disguise. Years later, when photographs of Joseph James DeAngelo were released after his arrest, many people struggled to reconcile the elderly man in custody with the terrifying figure described by survivors decades earlier. That contrast remains one of the defining lessons of the case. Extraordinary evil does not always announce itself. It often hides behind routines so ordinary that no one thinks to question them. As another year drew toward its end, investigators found themselves confronting an uncomfortable possibility. If the offender remained unidentified despite unprecedented public attention, growing forensic expertise, expanding interagency cooperation, and hundreds of dedicated investigators, how much longer could he continue? No one in those briefing rooms could have imagined the answer. Not another month. Not another year. But decades. The man they pursued would evade justice for more than 40 years, forcing generations of detectives to inherit the investigation from those who came before them. The murders had transformed California forever. Yet the greatest challenge still lay ahead. Finding a ghost who seemed determined to disappear into history itself, the investigation soon became unlike anything most detectives had experienced in their careers. Every new attack generated another mountain of reports. Patrol officers interviewed frightened neighbors while crime scene investigators worked methodically through homes that had become places of unimaginable violence. Detectives filled notebooks with observations, witness statements, timelines, and sketches of neighborhoods. Maps grew increasingly crowded with colored pins marking burglaries, sexual assaults, and murders that stretched across hundreds of miles of California. At first glance, the evidence seemed overwhelming. In reality, very little of it pointed toward a specific person. The offender left behind almost no fingerprints that investigators could use. He avoided carrying identifiable personal belongings. He rarely spoke long enough for victims to recognize a distinctive accent or speech pattern. His face remained hidden beneath masks or deep shadows. Even eyewitnesses who briefly encountered him outside crime scenes struggled to agree on details beyond his approximate age, build, and race. It was as though investigators were chasing an outline rather than a man. Yet despite the frustration, one thing became increasingly clear. The offender was remarkably consistent. Every crime scene revealed traces of the same disciplined thinking. Detectives began comparing reports from different counties, laying photographs and handwritten notes side by side across long conference tables. The similarities became impossible to ignore. The homes shared common characteristics. Single-story houses appeared frequently among the targets. Rear fences often provided easy access. Bedrooms faced away from busy streets. Neighborhoods offered multiple escape routes through parks, canals, bicycle paths, or undeveloped land. The offender seemed to avoid unnecessary obstacles. He preferred environments that allowed him complete control. Behavioral observations soon became just as important as physical evidence. Investigators noticed that the offender rarely selected homes completely at random. There were signs suggesting extensive surveillance beforehand. Telephone records revealed strange anonymous calls received by several victims before the attacks. Neighbors occasionally remembered unfamiliar men lingering near parks, or slowly riding bicycles through residential streets. None of those observations alone identified the suspect. Together, however, they described someone patient enough to spend days or even weeks preparing for a single crime. That level of planning fascinated experienced detectives. Many violent offenders acted impulsively. This one behaved more like a hunter. He observed before approaching. He waited before acting. He reduced uncertainty before taking risks. Every decision reflected preparation rather than emotion. Detectives soon began reconstructing the offender's likely movements before individual attacks. Imagine standing quietly beyond a backyard fence shortly before sunset. Children still laugh while playing nearby. Parents prepare dinner inside brightly lit kitchens. Dogs bark at passing pedestrians. Nothing appears unusual. The man standing in the shadows simply watches. He notices which bedroom light turns on first. He observes when curtains close. He listens to conversations drifting through partially opened windows. Hours pass. Darkness finally settles. The neighborhood grows quiet. Only then does he move. That imagined sequence fit the available evidence with disturbing accuracy. Several investigators became convinced that the offender sometimes entered properties before victims even returned home from work. Minor clues discovered after attacks suggested someone had previously tampered with windows, unlocked gates, or quietly explored interior rooms during daylight hours. Again, there was rarely enough evidence to prove such theories conclusively. But the pattern appeared repeatedly. It explained how the offender navigated unfamiliar homes so confidently once darkness arrived. He may not have been unfamiliar at all. For victims, that possibility remained almost impossible to accept. The thought that a stranger had walked silently through bedrooms while families were away, at work, or school introduced another level of psychological violation. The crime no longer began at midnight. It began much earlier. Perhaps while children sat inside classrooms. Perhaps while parents attended business meetings. Perhaps while families believed their homes were completely empty. The investigation also uncovered another troubling feature of the offender's behavior. He appeared physically fit. Escape routes often required climbing fences, crossing drainage canals, sprinting through uneven terrain, and disappearing before responding officers established effective perimeters. Several witnesses recalled seeing someone move with unusual speed despite darkness and obstacles. One pursuing officer later admitted feeling surprised by how effortlessly the suspect vanished into terrain that should have slowed anyone unfamiliar with the area. Physical conditioning alone did not explain everything. The offender also displayed remarkable composure under pressure. Many criminals panic when confronted unexpectedly. This offender adapted. If a neighborhood became too dangerous, he changed locations. If police increased patrols, attacks paused before resuming elsewhere. If investigators predicted one pattern, another quietly emerged. The ability to adjust frustrated detectives enormously. Every successful strategy seemed temporary. By the time law enforcement concentrated resources in one region, the offender had already shifted his attention somewhere else. Communication between police departments gradually improved, but the era itself created enormous challenges. There were no centralized digital databases connecting every investigative report across California. Detectives depended on mailed documents, telephone conversations, and face-to-face meetings. Photographs traveled physically. Evidence required transportation by hand. Comparing crimes separated by hundreds of miles demanded extraordinary effort. Despite those obstacles, investigators persisted. Special meetings brought together detectives from multiple jurisdictions. Crime scene photographs covered walls. Evidence charts stretched across entire rooms. Hours disappeared as investigators debated similarities and differences between cases. Some believed they were unquestionably pursuing one offender. Others remained cautious, warning against connecting crimes too quickly. Healthy skepticism remained essential. Serial investigations can easily drift toward confirmation bias if investigators force unrelated evidence into a single narrative. The Golden State Killer investigation required balancing open-mindedness with discipline. Fortunately, several detectives refused to abandon careful analysis. Among them were investigators who recognized the importance of preserving every available biological sample. At the time, forensic laboratories could identify blood types, examine hairs under microscopes, compare fibers, and analyze fingerprints. DNA profiling, however, remained in its infancy. The biological evidence recovered from multiple crime scenes possessed enormous potential, but very limited immediate value. Still, experienced investigators insisted upon preserving it. Evidence technicians carefully sealed samples. Labels were checked repeatedly. Storage conditions received special attention. Few realized those quiet decisions would one day rewrite the investigation. Elsewhere, frustration continued growing. Reporters questioned why law enforcement had not identified the offender. Editorials criticized communication failures between agencies. Citizens demanded stronger protection. Political leaders requested updates. The pressure on detectives intensified with every passing month. Yet inside interview rooms, investigators remained haunted by another reality. The survivors. Every interview required victims to revisit the worst night of their lives. Detectives listened patiently as survivors described whispers in the darkness, flashlights illuminating frightened faces, bindings cutting into wrists, and the unbearable helplessness that followed. Some interviews lasted hours. Others stretched across multiple days, because trauma made chronological memory extraordinarily difficult. Victims apologized repeatedly for details they could not remember. Investigators assured them that forgetting small things was completely understandable. The human brain often protects itself during extreme terror. Fragments remain. Sequences blur. Time itself becomes unreliable. Even so, those interviews proved invaluable. Patterns emerged not because every victim remembered identical details, but because dozens of independent accounts described remarkably similar behaviors. The offender's voice. His movements. His rituals. His confidence. The consistency strengthened investigators' belief that they were pursuing one exceptionally organized individual. What they still lacked was the single piece of evidence capable of transforming a behavioral profile into an arrest. A name. Without it, every breakthrough remained incomplete. The investigation had become a race between a growing body of evidence and a man who seemed to understand exactly how to stay invisible. And with every day that passed, detectives feared the next telephone call would announce yet another family whose ordinary evening had ended in irreversible tragedy. The growing stack of case files told a story that no single detective could fully see alone. Each police department possessed only part of the picture. A burglary report filed in one county sat in a cabinet hundreds of miles away from a homicide investigation in another. Sexual assault interviews remained stored in separate evidence rooms, disconnected by geography, jurisdiction, and the technological limitations of the era. The offender benefited from every one of those barriers. California was enormous. Every county maintained its own priorities. Every detective carried a heavy workload beyond this single investigation. Even when officers suspected connections, physically comparing hundreds of reports demanded weeks of painstaking effort. There were no searchable digital archives. No instant database linking crime scene photographs. No software capable of highlighting behavioral similarities across decades of offenses. The investigation relied almost entirely upon human memory. That reality placed extraordinary importance on experienced detectives who noticed subtle patterns others might overlook. One investigator remembered an unusual method of entry described years earlier. Another recalled nearly identical statements made by a survivor in another jurisdiction. A crime scene technician recognized similarities in binding techniques. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, isolated cases began forming a much larger mosaic. The offender, however, continued adapting. Whenever public attention intensified in one area, attacks seemed to migrate elsewhere. Some detectives wondered whether he monitored newspaper coverage obsessively. Others believed he listened to police radio transmissions using commercially available scanners. A few suspected he simply possessed an exceptional understanding of investigative procedures. Whatever the explanation, his decisions repeatedly suggested someone who anticipated law enforcement rather than merely reacting to it. That possibility became increasingly difficult to ignore. Behavioral analysts studying the offender noted another striking characteristic. He demonstrated remarkable emotional compartmentalization. The crimes required extensive planning, prolonged surveillance, and extraordinary psychological control. Yet outside those attacks, he apparently lived without attracting significant attention from employers, neighbors, or casual acquaintances. Such compartmentalization has been observed in certain highly organized offenders. They construct separate identities. One exists in public. Responsible. Ordinary. Predictable. The other remains hidden, surfacing only under carefully controlled circumstances. At the time, investigators could only speculate. No one knew whether the offender was married, whether he had children, whether he lived alone, whether he worked nights or days. Every possibility remained open. Meanwhile, the investigation generated thousands of leads. Telephone hotlines received constant calls from concerned citizens. Some callers reported suspicious neighbors. Others remembered former classmates with violent tempers. Anonymous letters accused co-workers, relatives, and complete strangers. Every credible lead demanded attention. Detectives interviewed military veterans, construction workers, delivery drivers, electricians, former police officers, college students, men arrested for unrelated sexual offenses. Again and again, promising suspects were carefully examined before ultimately being eliminated. The emotional cycle became exhausting. Hope. Investigation. Disappointment. Then another lead. Then another disappointment. For younger detectives entering the investigation, optimism remained strong. The evidence seemed substantial. The offender had made mistakes. Surely identification was only a matter of time. Veteran investigators viewed matters differently. They had already watched years disappear without resolution. Each unsolved attack deepened the realization that they were confronting someone unusually disciplined. Someone who planned further ahead than almost anyone they had previously investigated. The burden extended beyond professional frustration. Many detectives developed genuine emotional relationships with survivors and victims' families. Birthdays passed. Children graduated from school. Parents grew elderly. Some victims died before seeing justice. The investigation became more than a criminal case. It became a promise. A promise that no matter how much time passed, someone would continue searching. That promise quietly shaped the culture surrounding the investigation for decades. Evidence was never discarded simply because the case had grown old. Boxes remained carefully labeled. Photographs remained preserved. Interview recordings were protected. Every new advancement in forensic science prompted another review. Could this technology help? Could that laboratory discover something overlooked years earlier? Again and again, investigators revisited old evidence with renewed determination. Sometimes nothing changed. Sometimes small discoveries emerged. But the identity of the offender remained hidden. The media increasingly referred to the investigation as one of California's greatest unsolved mysteries. Television specials reconstructed the attacks. Newspapers published updated composite sketches. Criminologists debated the offender's psychology. Books examined the investigation from every conceivable angle. The public became fascinated. Yet fascination produced its own challenges. False confessions arrived with disturbing frequency. Some individuals claimed responsibility, despite possessing no knowledge of the crimes whatsoever. Others inserted themselves into the investigation seeking attention. Detectives patiently separated fantasy from fact, understanding that sensational cases inevitably attract unreliable information. The process consumed countless hours. Still, they persisted. One particularly frustrating aspect involved the offender's apparent understanding of forensic awareness. He minimized unnecessary contact with surfaces. He concealed his appearance. He frequently approached and departed on foot. He avoided leaving identifiable vehicles near crime scenes. Even decades before DNA revolutionized criminal investigations, he instinctively behaved in ways that reduced available evidence. Whether those habits developed through experience, intelligence, or professional training remained unknown. Years later, the answer would become painfully clear. Another mystery continued troubling investigators. Why had the attacks eventually stopped? Serial offenders rarely abandon criminal behavior without reason. Some die. Some become imprisoned for unrelated offenses. Some relocate. Others experience physical decline or changing personal circumstances. Without knowing the offender's identity, investigators could not evaluate any of those possibilities. The silence itself became another puzzle. Months passed without attacks. Then years. Eventually, newer investigations demanded greater attention. Fresh homicides required immediate resources. Current victims needed protection. The Golden State Killer investigation slowly transitioned from an active emergency into what detectives reluctantly described as a cold case. The phrase sounded almost clinical. Cold case. As though temperature alone had changed. For survivors, nothing felt cold. The memories remained vivid. The nightmares remained immediate. The unanswered questions remained alive every single day. Retired detectives carried those questions into retirement. Some kept personal copies of investigative notes. Others continued discussing the case long after leaving law enforcement, unable to accept that one of the most dangerous offenders in California history had simply disappeared. They believed he was still alive. Still somewhere. Living under an ordinary name. Walking ordinary streets. Perhaps even reading newspaper articles about the investigation that had failed to identify him. That possibility haunted everyone connected to the case. Because if the offender truly remained free, then every ordinary face passing unnoticed through a supermarket, every retired man tending his garden, every quiet neighbor waving politely across a fence carried an unsettling implication. Monsters did not always hide in abandoned buildings or isolated forests. Sometimes they hid inside completely ordinary lives. The investigation entered the new century carrying more questions than answers, but one thing remained unchanged. Locked inside carefully preserved evidence containers sat biological samples collected decades earlier. Technology had not yet fully revealed their value. Most people considered them remnants of an investigation slowly fading into history. A handful of determined investigators saw something different. They saw unfinished sentences. They saw the possibility that science had not yet reached its destination. They believed the evidence was still speaking. The world simply had not learned how to listen. That quiet belief would eventually become the turning point that transformed one of America's most infamous cold cases into one of the greatest investigative breakthroughs in modern criminal history.